what I'm going to do now is just become a little bit more sophisticated about each of these different operators. And so look at how we can take statements in English and then turn them into the symbols of propositional logic. So we'll start with the easiest one, and that's the tilde, which we use to translate essentially not. And so when the tilde is sort of the main idea behind a particular proposition, we call that a negation. So we'll take this sentence to begin with. Hot dogs aren't healthy foods. Now we're going to translate that into the symbols of propositional logic. And when we do, right, we're going to get tilde H. Tilde H. Now, I'm going to ask a very important question here, and that is, what does H stand for, right? What does that letter represent? And this is where we, again, need to remember that we're no longer dealing with categorical logic. We're dealing with propositional logic. So, to be clear, H here does not stand for hot dogs. It doesn't stand for healthy things anymore. H, in fact, stands for a complete proposition. Stands for hot dogs are healthy foods, that entire proposition. And then the tilde here represents not. Right, so the tilde is capturing the not. It's a very important adjustment to make here, especially as we transition from categorical logic to propositional. All right, so let's try this again to keep practicing it. It is not the case that bananas are vegetables. So here we see the word not, but of course it's encased in this entire phrase, it is not the case that. And so I'll just remind you again, at the end of section 5.1, there is a summary box at the top of that page there in your text, and it has the more complete list of all the words and phrases that these symbols are used to translate. And so it is not the case that is there with the tilde, and so that would tell us that, again, that we get tilde B as representing it is not the case that bananas are vegetables. Again, we could think about what does B stand for, but we'll remember that we're not dealing with categorical logic. So again, B here stands for bananas are vegetables. These uppercase letters always stand for simple affirmative propositions. One other thing here to note is that, as you see, the tilde is coming on the left-hand side of that uppercase letter. And you see that here with regard to tilde B as well. That's a convention that we use in propositional logic. These tildes are always going to come on the left-hand side of whatever they apply to. So with that, let's go ahead and look at something that's a bit more complicated. And that would be with regard to the dot. And when we're talking about the dot, we're talking about and. So we're talking about conjunctions, when you conjoin two propositions. All right. So I take the sentence, salami is tasty and apples are fruity. And so we have a couple short affirmative statements joined by the word and so what we would find is that this gets translated as S dot A. So S here stands for salami is tasty, the dot stands for and then the A stands for apples are fruity. We can throw a tilde into the mix here as well. We can say it is false that salami is tasty, but sausage is tasty. So now we have a tilde, and we're going to put that in front of the claim salami is tasty. We have the word but. Again, see the list at the end of 5.1. There you would find that the dot is used to translate the word but as well. And so we get tilde S dot G. It's false that salami is tasty, but, so here's the and then we can't use S again for sausage is tasty, since we've already used S to translate salami as tasty. So we'll just use some other letter, in this case G. Now, sometimes people have a concern that they're not sure they're going to know what is the correct letter here to use when translating these statements. And I just want to reassure you that when it comes to the exam on this material, when I ask you to translate statements, I will actually give you in the instructions the uppercase letters to use for prepositions follow. So you won't have to worry about choosing an appropriate letter. I'll give you the letters to use. All right, so with this example, both John and Bob are not employed. We're going to talk about these two individuals, John and Bob, for a few minutes here from this slide onto the next one, dealing with both the dot and then, as we'll see, with the wedge as well. So both John and Bob are not employed. We're going to obviously have a dot here. Going to have a dot, and so we have John. We know John is not employed, so we're going to have tilde J, and then also know that Bob is not employed. So this would say both John is not employed and Bob is not employed. In other words, both John and Bob are not employed. See that reflected here as well. Now, an important question though, and this is tricky a lot of times, but sometimes people look at this and they think, well, does this really mean the same thing as this statement? Tilde parenthesis J dot B. And we'll talk more about parentheses as we move along here, but do these two things, are they equivalent? Do they mean the same thing? Well, to think about that, we can break this down a little further and think about J dot B itself, just by itself. Of course, J dot B, given the context here for this example, would say John is employed and Bob is employed. John is employed and Bob is employed. Now, when we put parentheses around that whole thing, we're saying, okay, this tilde is going to apply to that whole statement. So we're saying it's not the case that John is employed and Bob is employed. So I'm going to say that one more time and think about what that means. It's not the case that John is employed and Bob is employed. Now, if we think about that, doesn't that statement actually allow for one of them to be employed, right? It's not the case that John is employed and Bob is employed. It simply says they're not both employed. At least one of them is out of a job, in other words. But if that's what this statement says, this one clearly doesn't have the same meaning, the one at the top here, because that would say that, in fact, John doesn't have a job for sure and Bob doesn't have a job for sure, but tilde parenthesis J dot B allows at least one of them to have a job. Right? So what we're doing is we're comparing these two statements. And the thing that I really just want you to take away from what I'm saying now is that these two statements are not the same. These two things don't mean the same thing. They have different meanings. Okay? We're not done with John and Bob. We're going to talk about them in the context of dealing with the wedge next. All right, so the wedge, of course, is either or, so we call these disjunctions as opposed to conjunctions. And so we might take the statement John or Bob is employed, right? And that's fairly simple. We're going to have J wedge B as our translation. John is employed or Bob is employed. Now, we can say as well, neither John nor Bob is employed. Neither meaning not either. Okay? So here's the key to thinking about this. This is John or Bob is employed, then neither John nor Bob is employed. Saying that it's not the case that either John or Bob is employed. Well, so this is neither John nor Bob is employed. Okay. On the other hand, we might say John or Bob is employed, but not both. Now this is a longer sentence, so we just break it down chunk by chunk. So we know how to say John or Bob is employed. We say J wedge B. Then we have a but, so we're going to have a dot, and then we have the rest of it. So right here, we have John or Bob is employed, but not both John and Bob are employed. Break it down if there are longer sentences like that. Right, either John or Bob is not employed. So now this is a different scenario. We're saying, it's like we met these people last night and we talked to them, and then it's the next day and we're thinking, okay, I'm thinking about these John and Bob individuals. I remember either John or Bob is not employed. Your memory isn't working great at this point. Well, in that case, we're going to get tilde J wedge tilde B. Right? Put that here. Either John is not employed or Bob is not employed. Notice something. As I've written these two here, you can compare them side by side. The top statement here again says neither John nor Bob is employed, right? This says neither one is employed. John doesn't have a job and Bob doesn't have a job, given this top statement. The second statement here, though, when we say either John or Bob is not employed, that actually allows for one of them to have a job. So once again here, what I want you to notice is that these two statements don't mean the same thing. They're not equivalent. They have different meanings. All right, let me back that up for just a second. So sometimes people think statements like this have the same meaning, when again, as we just saw, they don't. And I find that that's often the case when people think of tildes as negative signs in math. Tildes should not be thought of as negative signs in math. I think that tends to confuse people or at least lead people to the wrong conclusion about how to make these translations. So if you can, please avoid thinking of tildes as negative signs, and I think you'll be better off as a result.